Shalom and welcome to the European Report. Here we are in the heart of the European Union, in the European Parliament. And in today's programme, we will be discussing the Iranian threat, not only to Israel, but also to the Middle East and Europe. And this programme today, I'm joined by Bas Belder, MEP for the European Conservative and Reformist Group, and a friend of the European Report, as well as Thomas Sandel, the director and founder of the European Coalition for Israel, and Michael Severking, Deputy Director of the AGC, Transatlantic Institute. So welcome to the programme. Thomas, can you give us an update on some of the activities that you've been doing on behalf of Israel through the European Coalition for Israel? I know it's been a busy month.
Thank you, Simon. It is a busy month, and during these last few weeks I've been traveling to Moscow, to Rome, to Jerusalem, Brussels, back and forth. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an important meeting in the office of the Prime Minister in Jerusalem with his new foreign policy advisor, just looking at the situation in Europe right now, what the threats are, what the opportunities are. It was a great opportunity to have this direct link and be able to share our experience with the Israeli government. Also, during the same trip, I hosted a delegation of Romanian MEPs in Jerusalem because, as we will discuss later in this program, it's so important that the decision makers in Europe will see what Israel is all about, and also because Romania will become the next chair now of the European Union. What I would like to add to this initial comment is that the last time we met here, we were quite excited about a vote in a budgetary control committee to freeze 15 million euros. What happened after that recording, of course, is that the plenary did not vote according to the recommendation of the budgetary committee, which was a great disappointment for us. But on top of that, we found out in discussions with the European External Action Service that the proposed independent review of aid to the Palestinian textbooks, I should say, will not come to pass. And this was a great disappointment again, but something where we need to call our governments to accountability and make sure that they deliver on their promises. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and many more travels for me personally as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Thomas. And Michael, warm welcome to the programme. It's great to have you on the European Report. Can you share with us and our viewers pretty much the strategic threat posed by Iran, not only to Israel, but to the Middle East, particularly in light of the recent rocket and missile attack on southern Israel?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me on. The threat that Iran poses to Israel is not only through its direct buildup of ballistic missiles that are capable of hitting Israel proper, but also through its proxies, whether it be Hezbollah at the northern border, where it supplies over 120,000 guided missiles that can really cause a devastating destruction to Israel, but also through Hamas and even more so Islamic Jihad that have recently fired over 500 missiles on Israeli territory. One fatality. Quite ironically, this was a Palestinian man in Israel who was targeted, which goes to show again about the diversity of Israel as a democratic state.
Excellent, thank you. And Bas, we want to thank you and salute you for your courage, your bravery here in the European Parliament, standing up for Israel and the Jewish people, and you're a great friend of this programme, so it's always a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
Bas, if we look at what's happened recently, I mean, we've had over 460 rockets and missiles fired from the Gaza Strip into Israeli communities, the biggest number of rocket barrages in one single day. What is your response, and how should the response of members of this House, members of the European Parliament, shouldn't they be condemning these actions by Hamas and the devastation it's actually caused? And also, shouldn't we see condemnation on the Iranian regime for instigating the latest round of violence caused by Hamas and the friends of Hamas?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Simon, for having me.
Pleasure.
It disturbed me that during the spring and the summer that was so less attention in the European Parliament on the terroristic activities of Hamas towards Israel, that I decided before the summer in July to have a working trip to the southern part, the border region of Israel with Gaza. And I repeated this working trip some weeks ago, quite recently. And why? Because it should be obvious when you should have arguments and you should be updated about the precise situation on the grounds. The pain, the suffering of the local population, civilian population, people who have nostalgia, who have nostalgic thoughts about the past, that they had a normal relation with the Palestinian people in Gaza, when there was an exchange and that is over. They are longing for this period. I spoke with kibbutzim who said we have plenty workplaces for Palestinians in Gaza to relieve them, to give them help. In short, normal, free relations. And so what is my concern in this parliament? We should totally condemn the terrorist attacks, ongoing attacks, and the nature of Hamas, but we should also look how can we help the Gazan population together, of course, with the Israeli authorities, and to pay attention to the pain and the suffering of the civilian population in the southern part of Israel, and that's what I was missing. So my advice should be to my colleagues: go to the region, have a fresh look, and update yourself what is really going on before you are delivering here speech against Israel and the bias. For it is quite obvious that Israel is defending its own population, and that is the principal duty of every government, to defend its civilian population against ongoing terrorist attacks. And then on Iran, it is quite obvious that Iran is not only financially but also militarily stimulating this terrorism via Hamas or via Islamic Jihad. And for example, that explosion on luckily an empty bus, because the soldiers stepped down, that was with an advanced missile with Russian components, but was delivered by the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this parliament should hold accountable the Islamic Republic of Iran to what is going on from the Gaza Strip on terrorist attacks towards Israel. And and we cannot go on this way.
And Thomas, I kind of want to bring you in here. I mean, living here in Europe, we can't possibly imagine what it would be like for those Israeli towns and communities living next to the Gaza Strip to face over 460 missiles and rockets in one single day. How important is it that we follow the lead by Abbas and encourage members of the European Commission and others in the External Action Group to actually visit the towns and the cities neighbouring Gaza, so that they can see them for themselves the situation, particularly in light of this recent attack?
Yes. I think first of all it's important that decision makers in Europe visit Israel. So many, as Bas correctly said, are making statements and proposing solutions without having necessarily spent so much time in Israel, seeing the realities on the ground in Israel, how Jews and Arabs are working side by side. You know, I'm always struck by this. You visit Israel, you stay at a hotel, you never pay attention, you hear Arab and you know, Hebrew, and you know, they all get along. And to see on top of it all that this is the same reality in the disputed territories. In so many factories, we've spoken many times about SodaStream, how they could provide job opportunities for the Palestinian population. This is something that every decision maker should get acquainted with. But I think that the tide is turning. I see I would almost call it a seismic shift in Europe when it comes to having a greater understanding of Israel's situation. I'm not then referring primarily to what happens here in this house or in this city, but when you listen to the young Chancellor of Austria, for example, Sebastian Kurz, just last week, who said that in Europe, we need a greater understanding of the realities that Israel is facing. And he said, well, listen, Austria is living next door to Liechtenstein and Switzerland. They're not exactly the greatest threat in the world. But when you have Islamic Jihad, you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have Iran with a clear goal to annihilate the whole state. This is very different from anything we could experience in Europe. So yes, the more we know about the situations on the ground in Israel and obviously here now in southern Israel, the more we will be able to express ourselves intelligently and passionately in this situation.
Excellent. Michael, I'd very much like your views on this one. I mean, what would you say is the contributing factor to this latest round of rockets and missiles fired at Israel? Is this a diversion by the Iranian regime to take Israel's focus and attention off the situation that we're seeing the heavy build-up of Iranian troops 30 miles from Israel's border in Syria, the fact that Hezbollah have something like 180,000 rockets fired at Israeli towns and villages across the country. What's your assessment of the situation as you see it?
Well, I would say that it's fairly clear that whether there are sanctions in place or not, or whether there is a more assertive U.S. policy on Iran or a less assertive policy on Iran, that the basic overall ideology that is grounded within the state of the Islamic Republic of Iran is foundationally based upon the desire to destroy the state of Israel. It's an anti-Western outlook on the world. So I believe that this may have been somehow, there may well have been a trigger involved somewhere, but by and large, the strategy remains the same. You mentioned the missiles to the north of Israel and by Hezbollah. And the question we ask ourselves, I ask myself, is what can the EU do? What can the European Union do about this threat? And the EU is often conceived of as being a soft power. Whether it be development policy or investing in people-to-people projects on a conflict resolution basis. But in this particular case, tough diplomacy after the, let's say, insufficient JCPOA, to put it diplomatically, would be for the EU to, in a very concerted and very clear tone, state that Hezbollah will be responsible, and by proxy Iran will be responsible for any civilian casualties caused by the next Hezbollah war. And secondly, that Hezbollah must be blacklisted in its entirety, not just the fictitious division between a military and a political wing. And also, the FAC has to condemn the Iranian regime for continuing to arm Hezbollah in contravention of UN Security Council 1701, which Israel abided by. Okay, so will this now make Iran from one day to the other into a Jeffersonian democracy? Probably not, but it may well have an impact on their risk calculation of whether to basically unleash the Hezbollah weapon, because they can do that once. And when they do that once, there is complete annihilation on the side of Hezbollah. Significant damage, sadly, on the Israeli side. It will be hard to prevent after all this buildup, but the response will be devastating, and there will be a backlash. And for the Hezbollah's point of view, that could be conceived of as a double propaganda victory. You have the defeat of, quote-unquote, defeat of Israel, which is not true, and secondly, the own victims that can then be paraded around. But if somehow it's being told to them that they cannot have this win, and that the EU says in and of itself that we don't buy into that sham, that may have an impact on Iran's calculation.
Excellent. And Bas, would you say that members of this House are aware of the growing close strategic ties between Israel and many Arab Sunni states because they see the same threat coming from Iran, for example, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Gulf states, and the Saudis? And also, what do you make of the Israeli Prime Minister's historic visit to Oman, where he visited the Sultan the first time an Israeli government delegation has actually been met in Sultan since 1996. Isn't it time that the EU then reassesses which forces it decides to support in the Middle East in light of these changes going on in the region?
It is more than urgent to redirect our diplomatic attention. Two remarks. Firstly, on Oman. from the 70s on, there have always been relations between Israel and Oman, although this was the first visit after 20 years of the Prime Minister, of a high representative of the State of Israel. But that said, there were always relations, also military relations. And what is important, Oman has very close relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I guess, and I know already from sources, channels, that Prime Minister Netanyahu gives some important messages via Oman to Tehran and to Damascus. Very clever from the Israelis. And it underlines the approved status of Israel in the region. Brussels should take notice of this. Why? When Brussels is always repeating there's only one solution, there's a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then the solution, they should have in mind that Oman has relatively good relations with both Israelis and the Palestinians. Also more than the other states. Secondly, that is the last years a gradual process of more strong relations, more close relations between the Arab world, the Gulf states, and Israel because of this common threat.
Absolutely.
So when you see this diplomatic situation and the improved status of Israel, the EU should do well to join this redirection of the forces that are active in the region and not count on Iran that is seen as an aggressor, as a threat. So two-state solution, fine. For what is the way and what do you see? It is clever from the Trump administration, the United States and Israel are joining their efforts to count on the moderate Arab regimes to make a clear message to the Palestinian Authority to go to the negotiation table.
Excellent, thank you, Bas. And Thomas, what opportunities are now presenting themselves for Israel in terms of its diplomatic relations with the European Commission in light of this growing strategic relationship in the Middle East between Israel and the moderate Sunni Arab states? In your opinion, that is.
Yeah, it's interesting again how passive somehow the European External Action Service has been in this huge development in the Arab world. And as your question indicates, this should be an opportunity also for all the good forces in Europe to say that, listen, this is almost unprecedented. The Prime Minister of Israel visits Oman. The national anthem of Israel is played in Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. These were things we could only dream about, say, 5-10 years ago, and now they're happening. And again, I don't see, I may be missing something very significant, but I don't see the proactiveness of the European Union to say, wow, here we have a great momentum, we should be supporting what is happening. Instead, there is this obsession with keeping the Iranian regime alive and strengthening it and doing business with it. And it's, for me, it's completely in opposition with all the values that we are set to represent. And I think for Israel, obviously Israel is the big winner in this whole equation, and the EU seems to be losing more and more of its traction in the region. But we should hope, and obviously we have an election coming up in just 6 months from now, and things will change in Brussels, I believe. And I just hope and pray that this would be a new window of opportunity for more of a sober outlook in the Arab world, and not go on with the old answers to old questions, starting with the saying that the Palestinian is the root cause for all the problems in the world. People don't buy that anymore. But as I said earlier, I do see a clear change, even in Europe, not only in the Middle East, which is changing. Europe is changing, and I think we'll see some interesting results here in June when the new European Parliament will come together.
Thank you, Thomas. And, Michael, I attended recently when I was in Jerusalem an IDF briefing on the security situation facing Israel. And it very much seems that the Israelis will not tolerate a very big military presence in Syria. And the fact is that the Iranian forces are now 30 miles from Israel's border. And because they can't coerce the Sunnis into supporting them, because the majority of the population are Sunni rather than Shiite in Syria. So do you think that in 2019 we could face a major escalation between Israel and Iran in Syria and in Lebanon?
Well, war, unfortunately, in this part of the world is always a possibility. It's always a risk. We have seen many close calls over the past months and years. Israel with Russia has a deconflicting mechanism that allows both sides to operate and enforce their policies. Israel has, as you alluded to, a certain set of red lines that it will not tolerate being put into question. One of them is permanent Iranian bases in Syria. And we've seen over the past year that Israel has forcefully enforced these lines. Now, as it relates to the ballistic missile threat emanating from Iran, we have to remember that this was not covered by the JCPOA. So therefore, we've seen that even if Iran was abiding by all the provisions of this agreement.
So you mean the Iran deal, just for
the Iran deal, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear agreement of 2015. Even if Iran is abiding by it, they're still able to pose this threat to Israel. And really, to give you, from my point of view, an impression of the nature of the provocative, really thumbing their nose at European and American leaders and Israel is when they scrawl on one of these ballistic missiles, "Death to Israel." And this is literally a provocation that says a lot about the nature of this regime and also its aggressive policy. So do I believe that war is possible? I do. However, as I mentioned before, unleashing Hezbollah would have to be really a last resort, I would say, from their point of view. I would hope it's not going to happen, and Israel's deterrence is working thus far.
Thank you. Down to the last 2.5 minutes, Bas, and I have to get your opinion because I think what's happened on this continent is very significant, and that's the fact is that the Iranian regime tried to assassinate 3 Iranian dissidents in Denmark and accused them of belonging to a terrorist organization. We haven't seen the Iranians carry out assassination policies since the 80s and 90s. So therefore, does now Iran pose a threat to European security, in your opinion?
Absolutely. Last week, so quite recently, a very courageous Iranian exile. He is exiled, he is a dissident since 1983. He wrote an opinion article in an influential Dutch newspaper, and he said, intimidation, threats with terror should not silence him. And he was calling and accusing even my government, the Dutch government, to stand up to this terrorist threat from the Iranian regime. It is totally back in the European streets, in European capitals. So it is it was a really strong wake-up call. And he told about phones, and he told also that there is inside the Iranian society, the Iranian exile society, there is a great fear. They even destruct each other because infiltration. So we should follow the lead of Denmark, should be followed by the Dutch government, other governments to stand up to these threats and to take measures, and also take it in account with the whole European approach to the Islamic Republic of Iran. We know when I was a journalist, I read an excellent book of an Iranian exile. He was a poet, Said, and it was about the long arms of the Iranian regime in Europe. They are totally back.
Absolutely. And about a minute to go to the end of the programme. So Thomas, do you believe that the EU should now change its foreign policy towards Iran in light of this assassination attempt on European soil?
Short answer, yes. But what I wanted to say last minute is I think it's very clear that Iran is not only primarily a threat to Israel, to the Western world, to Europe, it's a threat to its own people. And this is something we are often missing. And the privilege of being in contact with Iranians in the diaspora in Europe, and they keep telling this message on and on again. And they're very disappointed that the leaders in Europe don't back them up when they fight for their most basic freedoms in Iran. This is what it's all about, and we should be on the right side of history.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on today's European Report. And I just want to thank you all for watching today's programme here in the European Parliament, in the heart of the European Union. And it's important that we raise awareness about the Iranian threat, not only to Israel, not only to the Middle East, but also to European security as well. So thank you for watching today's European Report.